Welcome back to the deep dive. I'm really glad you're here with us today. Usually when we crack open these archives, we are strapping ourselves in for a high-velocity tour of complex systems.
Right, or dissecting rapid-fire tech trends.
Exactly. We're usually talking about how to build a warp drive or the physics of black holes. But today, I want to slow things down. I really want to shift the tempo completely.
It's a necessary shift, I think. We aren't looking at a battle map today. Or some star chart filled with expanding empires.
Oh, we're not.
We are looking at a reconstruction of a renaissance, but not a loud, boisterous one. This is a very quiet renaissance.
Yeah, quiet is the perfect word. I want you to imagine we are walking into a very old, very silent archive, the kind where the dust motes are dancing in a single beam of light and the air smells like dry stone and ancient parchment.
It's a great image.
We aren't here for blueprints or schematics today. We are here to reconstruct a feeling. We are piecing together a specific pivotal moment in history from the Orion Saga archives, specifically a document labeled PDF 006, Asclea and the Rise of the Antares.
And our mission here is to figure out how a civilization that had completely destroyed itself managed to pull itself back from the brink. And the kicker is, they didn't do it by fighting harder.
Right.
They didn't invent better weapons. They did it by thinking differently.
It's sort of the story of the morning after. And frankly, that is often the most difficult part of history to analyze. I mean, it's easy to understand the explosion, right?
Oh, absolutely. The explosion is loud. It leaves obvious marks.
Exactly. It is much harder to understand how you pick up the pieces and glue them back together in a shape that won't just break again. So, before we get to the gluing, we do need to set the scene. Just a tiny bit of context on the break.
We have to know what was lost.
Right. We've touched on the old Antares before, the Alt Antarana, but let's just establish the baseline. They were the ones who had it all.
They did. They were the titans of their era. Brilliant, ambitious, completely driven by unchecked progress. They viewed knowledge as a ladder to be climbed, and they climbed it incredibly fast.
What's that?
Way too fast. As the archives state, the ladder got too tall. Their hubris, specifically regarding the creation of artificial minds and the exploitation of their planet's core energy, it led to a total collapse. The first AI war.
Which, to put it mildly, was an absolute catastrophe.
It ended in complete ruin. The source actually describes it as a world where Prometheus's body shattered.
That is a very poetic way of saying the infrastructure, the government, the supply lines, it was all gone.
Everything. The world was broken. The previous era of progress wasn't just paused. It was over.
So I want you to picture this. The war is over. The great cities are smoking ruins. The leadership is dead. The survivors are just scattered out in a wasteland. Now, in a typical story, or even in most of human history, this is the moment where the warlord rises up.
Right, the strong man.
Exactly. Someone strong, maybe a general, grabs the biggest stick, seizes the throne, and forces everyone to get in line for their own safety.
That is the standard historical pattern.
Yeah.
Chaos creates a vacuum, and tyranny usually fills it because fear makes people desperate for a strong hand.
But that's not what happened here, and that is where she comes in. Asclea. Now, PDF 006 presents her not as a queen or a conqueror, but as something much quieter.
Asclea is almost the anti-warlord.
Yeah.
And to really grasp why this new society worked, you have to understand her mindset. She wasn't looking for power.
No.
The archives mention she had a connection to the Guardians of Doctrine, those cosmic preservers of order we've seen in earlier records. But she rejected their rigidity just as much as she rejected the chaos that destroyed her people.
She was an observer, an archivist at heart.
Yes.
The source describes her role immediately following the collapse as an exile. That's a strong word. She didn't try to take over the ruins of the capital to rebuild the empire. She literally walked away. Why?
That decision is the foundation of everything that follows. She led a handful of followers away from the centers of power out into the silence of the wasteland. It's a profound statement.
She was signaling something.
She was signaling that the old ways, the ways of centralization, of grasping for the throne, of trying to force the world to bend to your will, those were the disease.
Wow.
By choosing exile, she chose responsibility over control. She was essentially saying, I am not going to rule the ashes. I am going to plant something new in the desert.
And out of that exile comes the doctrine of equilibrium, or balance. Now, I have to be honest, when I hear balance, I usually think of someone sitting in the lotus position chanting.
Or a really boring spreadsheet where all the columns have to match.
Exactly. But reading through PDF 006, that's not really what this was, is it?
Not at all. It wasn't religious mysticism, and it wasn't some bureaucratic compromise. It was a strict survival strategy. You have to remember, she had just watched her civilization get torn apart by two extremes.
Right.
On one side, the chaotic influence of the Noctia, that unbound passion, unchecked growth. On the other, the rigid, unyielding order of the Guardians. Asclea realized that neither side worked in the long run.
So she forged a third path.
Precisely. The doctrine of equilibrium was about observation and taking responsibility. Think of it less like a static state, like a rock sitting in the middle of a scale.
Okay.
Think of it more like walking a tightrope.
That's a great image, because on a tightrope, you aren't perfectly still, you're constantly moving.
Exactly. It's a highly dynamic state. You are constantly adjusting. If you lean too far to the left, you fall. Too far to the right, you fall. It requires constant active attention.
So it's not about finding a middle ground and going to sleep?
No, it's about being awake to the forces pushing and pulling you.
So it's the exact opposite of dogma. Dogma says, here are the rules, follow them blindly. Asclea's teaching was, look at the world, see the consequences of your actions, and adjust accordingly.
It was entirely about awareness. And this is where the high culture of the Antarans really begins. It wasn't about being good in a traditional moral sense. It was about being aware in a highly practical sense.
Meaning what, exactly?
Meaning, if we do X, will it destroy the water supply in 10 years? If yes, then we don't do X.
Yeah.
Even if it makes us incredibly rich today. It's a very pragmatic form of wisdom.
There's a fascinating detail in the source document about her refusal of divinity. I mean, if you save a civilization, people are naturally going to want to build statues of you. They're going to want to worship you.
Right.
It's a very common sentient impulse to want the savior.
And she explicitly forbade it. No temples were built to her. No rituals were established in her name. The source is very clear on this. Balance wasn't faith. It was habit.
It was habit. That's powerful.
She knew that if she became a crutch, if people started worshiping her instead of practicing what she taught, the whole thing would fail as soon as she was gone.
That's a level of foresight that is genuinely hard to wrap your head around. It's almost like she was designing a system to run without an engine.
She was designing a culture, not a cult. A cult relies on the leader. A culture relies on the shared habits of the people. And eventually she did go.
She left.
She withdrew. Once she saw the culture truly take root, she stepped back and just faded away into the archives. She ensured she didn't become a permanent concentration of power. That is an incredibly rare trait in history. The ability to know when your part is simply done.
So she plants these seeds of thought. But thought has to live somewhere, right? It needs a physical environment. Let's talk about the physical reality of this new world. Because Antares isn't the lush paradise it used to be in the old days.
Not at all.
We aren't talking about rolling green hills here.
No. By this point, Antares is a dying world. The source paints a very stark picture. The suns are twin brown dwarfs.
Brown dwarfs, so the light is what? Dim red.
It's a twilight world. Perpetual dusk. The suns barely provide enough heat to keep the atmosphere from freezing over completely. The oceans have shrunk away. It's an arid wasteland of endless dunes.
It sounds incredibly bleak.
It is a harsh, unforgiving place. It's the kind of world where you simply cannot afford to be careless.
And yet, they survive. But they completely change how they live. The old Antaran treated the planet like a resource to be mined. They drilled into the core, the flame, to power their impossible tech. How does the new society, the society of Asclea, treat the flame?
They treat it as lifeblood. The flame is the planetary core, the source of life energy that keeps the entire biosphere running since the suns can't do the job anymore. The old Antarans saw it as a battery. Asclea taught them to see it as a heartbeat.
That is a massive shift in perspective. If you drain a battery, you just get a new one. If you stop a heartbeat, the organism dies.
And you are the organism living on it. That shift in perspective changed everything about how they built their cities. The source mentions they completely stopped blind sprawl.
This is one of the most practical applications of the doctrine of balance that I read. They didn't just build wherever they wanted.
They built around oases. They strictly limited the size of their settlements to fit the environment. In the old days, if a city grew too big for the local water supply, they probably would have just built a massive pipeline or terraformed the whole region by force.
They would have bent the planet to fit the city.
Exactly.
Right, the whole conquer the desert mentality, man versus nature.
But the new Antaran said, the desert is the reality. We are the guests. They adapted their population and their architecture to fit exactly what the planet could provide. It's a complete shift from dominating nature to stewarding a very fragile system. It's a quiet acknowledgement of limits.
And speaking of nature, the archives mention that new species started appearing in the wasteland. Tough, weird little creatures that could survive the harshness. Now, usually when a new bug shows up in your perfectly planned city, you call the exterminator.
But the Antares didn't exterminate them. They didn't view them as pests or competitors. They observed them. They logged them. The source explicitly says they only touched the ecology when strictly necessary to maintain stability.
That is a level of restraint that is honestly shocking. They are living on a dying rock, resources are incredibly scarce, and they still choose to share it rather than dominate it.
It's because they realize that they're just another species trying to survive, same as the desert lizards. That's the true humility that the collapse taught them. They realized they weren't the masters of the universe anymore. They were just inhabitants.
So we have a society that is humble, observant, and highly sustainable. But let's dig into the social structure a bit more. How is it actually organized? We already said no religion. But PBF 006 is really specific about this. It calls it a stable society characterized by the absence of organized religion. That seems highly risky.
Highly risky from a traditional sociological standpoint, yes.
Usually, religion is what holds people together when things get tough. Yeah. It provides the social glue, the shared rituals. If you take that away, what replaces it?
It can be the glue, yes, but it can also be a massive source of division. Asclea essentially replaced the temple with the school. Instead of places of worship, they built huge halls for discussion. The glue holding society together wasn't a shared belief in a deity. It was a shared commitment to a method of thinking.
A method of thinking. So critical thinking became the ritual.
In a sense, yes. The act of balancing, of carefully analyzing consequences, became the shared cultural activity. Balance wasn't faith, it was habit. You see how that line keeps coming back? It wasn't about what you believed. It was entirely about how you acted.
Okay, but someone has to be in charge. You can't just have everyone debating philosophy in a hall all day. The trash still needs to be collected. Decisions need to be made about water rationing. Who makes the call?
True. Logistics still exist. But they didn't go back to kings or warlords. They established the keepers.
The keepers of knowledge. Now, this sounds a little bit like a priesthood, doesn't it? Or maybe a council of elders.
It sounds like it, but the function is totally different. This is, to me, the most fascinating innovation of the Antares political structure. The keepers weren't rulers in the traditional sense. They were archivists. They were watchers.
But they held the power.
Yeah, their knowledge. And in the Antares worldview, those two things are very different. The keepers operated on the strict principle that knowledge means duty. Remember, the previous civilization destroyed itself because it accessed knowledge.
Like AI, the core energy, the weapons.
Exactly. They accessed it without the ethics to handle it.
So the keepers were the gatekeepers. They made sure that dangerous knowledge wasn't just left lying around for anyone to pick up and misuse.
Precisely. They prevented the permanent concentration of power by ensuring that power, specifically dangerous technological knowledge, was only held by those who deeply understood its weight.
So it wasn't about keeping secrets just to be secretive.
No, it was about safety.
Yeah.
It was a direct, hard-learned lesson from the apocalypse. If you give a child a loaded gun, tragedy happens. The keepers were the ones ensuring the gun was locked away until the child grew up.
It creates a system where the smartest people aren't trying to get rich or become famous. They are just trying to keep everyone safe.
And where the leaders are defined by their caution, not their ambition. This created what the archives call the high culture. I really love the description of their temperament in the source material. It calls them cool-headed, long view, consequence aware.
Consequence aware. That's a phrase we could probably use more of today. It sounds like they were constantly playing chess, thinking 10 moves ahead before doing anything.
Absolutely. Every single decision was weighed against its long-term impact on the equilibrium. They weren't perfect. The archives are very honest about that. But when they made mistakes, they handled them better.
They didn't double down.
No, they adjusted. Because they weren't attached to being right, they were attached to surviving.
And the result of all this restraint, a long era of peace. But here's the kicker, and I want to quote the source directly here because it totally flips the script on how we usually think about politics. It says, peace wasn't the goal. It just happened.
That is the ultimate paradox of peace. If you try to force peace, you almost always end up going to war to enforce it. The whole, we will have peace even if I have to kill everyone to get it mentality.
Right, the peace through strength model. Or the empire that conquers everyone around them just to stop the border skirmishes.
Exactly. But the Antaran didn't focus on peace. They focused on balance. They focused on limited growth, on inner coherence, on strict sustainability. And because they weren't trying to expand their borders or steal resources from their neighbors, war simply became unnecessary.
It makes perfect sense. If you aren't trying to take your neighbor's lawn, you don't need to build a giant fence or buy a guard dog.
And if you are completely happy with the size of your own house, you don't need to burn down your neighbor's house to build an extension. This version of the Antaran had absolutely no expansionist impulses.
None at all.
None. They were distinct from almost every other major galactic empire in the saga in that regard. They didn't want to conquer the stars, they just wanted to deeply understand their home.
That's such a stark contrast to the human history we know, or even the later empires we see in the saga. We almost always equate civilization with growth. Bigger is always better. More land, more planets, more power. The Antaran reached a high point of culture by explicitly saying this is enough.
And that enough bought them thousands of years of stability. Conflicts were small, local, and contained. They didn't spiral into world wars because the societal structures, the keepers, the daily habit of balance, they naturally dampened the flames before they could ever spread.
But I think it's important to remember, and you touched on this earlier, this wasn't some naive utopia born out of innocence. They weren't peaceful because they were soft.
No, not at all. They were peaceful because they were traumatized. The expert analysis in the archives strongly emphasizes that this utopia was born from the legacy of scars. They vividly remember the old Antaran. They remember the fire and the literal draking of the world.
There's a haunting line. Antares became home again because of the scars, not despite them. It really suggests that you can't have true wisdom without profound pain.
Or at the very least, that pain is a highly effective teacher, if you are actually willing to listen to the lesson. Asclea's genius was that she ensured her people didn't forget the pain, but she also didn't let it destroy them with despair. She turned trauma into a stance.
Chaos became a reason for stability.
Exactly. It's a complete cultural reconstruction. They took the worst thing that ever happened to them, the apocalypse, and used it as the absolute bedrock foundation for the best thing that ever happened to them, the high culture.
And in doing so, they became the Antaran of legend. When later civilizations in the Orion saga look back at the Antaran, they aren't looking at the tech-obsessed old Antaran. They are looking at this specific era, the era of the wise, silent librarians living on the dunes.
It really changes how you view the whole concept of advancement, doesn't it? We usually think of advancement as new tech, faster engines, massive cities. If you don't have flying cars, are you even advanced?
Right. But this deep dive suggests that maybe the ultimate advancement is internal. It suggests that true advancement is just the ability to sustain oneself, to exist in perfect equilibrium with your environment and your own nature. It's not flashy, it doesn't look like a blockbuster sci-fi movie, but it lasts.
It lasts. And the mission of this deep dive was to reconstruct that turning point. And I think we can see it clearly now. It wasn't a grand battle. It was a quiet change of mind. A collective decision to stop running and start watching.
And a decision to trust in the slow, quiet work of building a culture rather than the fast, loud work of building an empire.
Precisely.
So as we close the book on PDF 006 and step out of this mental archive, wiping the dust off our sleeves, I really want to leave you with a thought. We live in a world that is completely obsessed with infinite growth. We are always looking for the next frontier, the next market, the next technological breakthrough. We are genuinely terrified of standing still.
We are. But the story of Asclea asks us a very difficult question. Is true advancement actually found in stopping?
Is the ultimate sign of a mature civilization, or even just a mature person, the ability to look at power, look at the endless potential for expansion, and choose to put it down, to simply say, I have enough, I will tend to what is here?
It is a question well worth asking. Because as the Antaran learned the hard way, sometimes the absolute only way to save the world is to stop trying to conquer it.
A profound lesson from the dunes of Antares. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time.